Know the past, shape the future. Welcome to the official podcast of the Air Force Historical Foundation. A quick programming note, we've divided this story into two parts, so make sure you subscribe now so you don't miss the second half. On this episode, we're talking to Dr. Jan Davis, author, astronaut, and engineer. Her new book, Airborne: Two Generations in Flight, happened after a chance encounter when she discovered her father's World War II POW journal. Her father, Ben Smotherman, was a B-17 pilot flying missions over Europe. But after 21 months, he was shot down July of 1943 in Holland and spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 3. And like so many others, he never talked about it. But thankfully, the one time he did, he shared his journal with his daughter Jan. Jan's book not only tells her father's story, but it explores the connections between his experiences and her own as an astronaut on the space shuttle. Here now is Dr. Jan Davis.
Well, it's interesting. I loved airplanes, and I love to look at, the sky and see planes. So I knew that I wanted to be a pilot someday, just like him. But, I didn't really think about the space program because at that time, being an astronaut or being involved even in the space program wasn't an option for girls or for women. So I didn't really think about that. Although I grew up during the time when we were going to the moon and when the space program was very active because of that. And I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, where we were testing the engines and the rockets that were going to the moon. So I was fascinated with the space program, but I didn't really dream about working on it. I guess I don't know. I didn't really have aspirations other than, loving math and science and just wanted to do something with that.
It's interesting that one of the movies that I love, October Sky, there are no girls standing behind that makeshift launch platform that Homer and all those guys had set up. But yet there you were, right there in Huntsville, Alabama, where all of this was going on. Did you ever even think that someday you would have had this incredible NASA career that you've not only had, but as you pointed out, it's just a small part of your larger career, but here you are as an astronaut, which is I can't even think of the percentile of people who have left Earth. I mean, it's staggering, the odds that you're of.
It's around 500 people went to space. But when I was growing up, of course, I was fascinated with the space program, like everyone was in that era, and landing on the moon. But by the time I was in high school, the space program was pretty much gone, in the 70s, early 70s. After we went to the moon, there was only one mission left. That was the Apollo-Soyuz in 1975. So people were getting laid off all around me in Huntsville, Alabama. So, I didn't think that was an option. I thought, we didn't have a space program or something like that I could work in. It would have been marvelous if it had kept going at that point, but we didn't really get going again until the space shuttle program, which was after I already graduated from college. So I'm glad I majored in engineering and was able to transition into the space program, but I didn't even go to work. It was not a possibility when I graduated from college. I went to work in the petroleum industry. That's where the jobs were.
We need to rewind a bit because there's an important piece to this story we haven't talked about yet. In fact, Jan's book might not have happened at all because of this. In the immediate years following World War II, it wasn't all roses. In the 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, America's divorce rate was 17%, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the folks who track all this stuff. But in the 1940s, after the war, the divorce rate in America nearly doubled. It jumped to 28%. Jan's family like so many others, faced this head on.
What did your dad think about all of this early on? What did he think you were going to become? Did he ever say?
No, and by the way, I didn't grow up with my father, who was the pilot, and B-17 pilot, because my parents divorced when I was 4, and my mother remarried Davis, which is why I have that name. But I kept in touch with my father, and he was elated that I went into engineering and that I liked math and science, because that's what he studied when he was, before he was sent off to the war. He was studying engineering, and he was a draftsman. I mean, that's what he did to earn money to go to school and to pay for flying lessons. And so he was just really excited that I was studying engineering, and he was very forward thinking about it. He said, not many women go into engineering, and so that's fantastic that you want to do that, and you have that ability, to be an engineer and to like working with people and teamwork and all of those things that engineering requires. So he was very excited about that.
And then Marshall changed everything. 1979, here you are.
Mm-hmm. Right.
A young aerospace engineer, and boom, this job falls in your lap, so to speak. Talk to me about that, because that's incredible that you get picked up for this.
Yes. As I said, in the 70s, NASA wasn't hiring. People were getting laid off. Nobody was majoring in aerospace engineering. I majored in mechanical engineering and went to work in the oil industry. And then all of a sudden, and that's where I was working when I applied to go to work for NASA in Huntsville as an engineer. And that's when they started hiring again, getting ready for space shuttle. Because the first space shuttle flight was in 1981. And so they were looking for people to work on the space shuttle program and the things that were going to fly on the space shuttle. So that was incredible to me. I moved back to Huntsville. I'd been living in Houston, working in the oil industry. Moved back to Huntsville, my hometown, went to work for NASA, and they hadn't hired new people in about 10 years. So I was one of the first young people, the younger person there, and female. So it was really interesting. I went to work with people who had worked in the Apollo program and learned from them. So that was pretty exciting to be home, to be at NASA, and to be working with people that sent us to the moon.
So what was the culture like? Let's dive into this a little bit. You sort of touched on it. You said it was a little interesting. So what's it like? I mean, you walk in day one. What's it like at NASA back then?
Well, everyone was super passionate about what they did, but they kept talking about the good old days, and I would tell them, I said, these are the good old days for me. And then, hopefully made them realize that getting ready for a new program, the space shuttle program, was an opportunity and something we should all be positive about and forward looking about, and not just look backwards at Apollo. Certainly learn from Apollo, but not, dwell on it. So that was one thing. The other thing was being a young female engineer, which none of them were used to. I think they were a little skeptical as to whether I could do the work. And so the only thing I remember about that is that I felt like I had to prove that I could do the work. And once I proved that I could do the work, they were super supportive. They were very encouraging. They gave me all kinds of opportunities. But I do believe they were a little skeptical at first. And certainly there was no discrimination or, anything like that about being female. So that was really good. I was concerned about that. The culture was very supportive and very encouraging. A learning environment. They were very eager to teach me, things that I needed to learn to do my job. I was working on the Hubble Space Telescope, And the structures part of the Hubble Space Telescope, making sure it didn't break when it launched, that's what I was responsible for. So it was just a fascinating project to be working on, and everyone was very encouraging, and I had great opportunities, great exposure, and wonderful supervisors. So it was a very supportive environment, but I do feel like I had to prove that I could do the work first.
I've got to ask, because I can just imagine what that must have been like for a young lady, brilliant, working on the Hubble Space Telescope at this point, what it was like on a Friday night when you went out. Because what do you talk about? I mean, how do you relate to the folks that are, going out on a Friday night too? How does that work?
Well, I was eager to talk about Hubble Space Telescope because, at that time we were building it and people didn't know that much about it. And I would talk to anybody who was listening, somebody on an airplane or, out to dinner or whatever. I wanted to talk about the Hubble and what it would do and what its capabilities were. And so that was the fun part, because people, in Huntsville were very interested in that kind of thing. And so it was really fun for me to talk about it, because we had a great team working on the project. And as I said, I had great opportunities. I traveled places where they were building the telescope and saw the hardware and saw it being tested. And so for me, a 20-something year-old engineer, I was just so excited to have that opportunity. And as I said, they let me, give presentations at big meetings and, travel and interact with people who were building the telescope. And it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for me.
Let's talk about risk. As an engineer, when you're building something as monumental as the Hubble Space Telescope and later the Chandra Observatory project that you worked on, how overpowering is that element of risk when you're working on something like this?
Yes, it really is on your mind, while you're working on it, because when we were building the Hubble, and I was working on the graphite epoxy portions, the composite materials that were not metal, and back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was kind of unusual to use those materials. And so we were having a lot of problems with them. And we fortunately did a lot of testing on the structural part, and a lot of it broke, and so we had to replace those graphite epoxy parts with titanium. And so, our job was to not only make sure that the whole structure of the telescope didn't break during launch, but also when it was all in orbit to maintain alignment between the instruments and the image that was coming in. And so the structure had to be strong, but also not expand and contract with the thermal changes as it orbited. So that was a tremendous responsibility, and one, of course, there was a lot of scrutiny from the instrument people. They wanted to make sure their instruments, we get the right alignment and that sort of thing. It's unfortunate that the optics part was the part that wasn't tested to the point where they could verify they had the right optics. And so that's unfortunate. But the structural part that I worked on, and those other people who worked on that worked really well. And so, that's the risk is part of it. But we did everything we could to make sure that it worked from a structure standpoint. I'll also add that during that time, I was assigned the latch fittings that attach the science instruments to the telescope. And those fittings are what the astronauts use to take the instruments in and out to replace them. So on orbit, they would take the instruments out, put a new instrument in. And so I was responsible for those fittings. And that way, I was able to swim in the water tank that they had at Marshall Space Flight Center with the astronauts, because the astronauts, train underwater because it's the closest thing to floating in space. And so I was able to be a diver and work with them on these latches and the design, and made sure it was, compatible with the way they wanted to operate, taking the instruments in and out. And so that's the first time I really met astronauts and was able to interact with them. So that was another big bonus of working on the Hubble Space Telescope program.
As Jan's career was speeding along with Hubble, so was the Space Shuttle program. And then on January 28th, 1986, things changed.
At NASA, at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, whenever there was a launch, we would all go in the conference room and watch the launch. And it was just silence, because the people at Marshall that I worked with worked in the propulsion area. That's what Marshall Space Flight Center is responsible for. So they knew that it was probably something in one of the elements that Marshall managed, whether it was the external tank or the engines or the boosters. And so it was just silence as we walked out of the room, just devastated. And my mother called me right after the accident and asked if I still wanted to be an astronaut. There's risk in everything we do, and this is something I believe is worth the risk, and I still want to be an astronaut. So later in the day, we all were assigned things to start looking at, data to start looking at, or things to do. And we just were working feverishly because we wanted to find out what happened. Of course, it was not long before we knew that it was the boosters, and it was a little bit later that I was assigned to work on the redesign of part of the booster, the external attach ring, which attaches the booster to the external tank, and we were redesigning it so to make it structurally better during launch. There was no problem with it really that affected the accident, but nevertheless, we redesigned a lot of the booster after the accident just to make it better. So the culture at the time was, we all were just working, oh gosh, round the clock, and nights, weekends, whatever, to make sure that this didn't happen again. And I was briefing review committees, and I had a team of people working with me on the redesign. One was from another NASA center, so it was just incredible dedication and determination to make sure that we redesigned this booster so that this wouldn't happen again.
Let's talk about 1987. A lot changed in 1987. You got this call. How does that call work? Is it like, is it this big, incredible call? You get brought into an office? How does that work when they say, hey, you're going to be an astronaut?
As I said, I interviewed in 1984, and I didn't get selected. So I got that call that I had not been selected. And basically, the selection board is made up of different NASA managers and is headed by a man named George Abbey, who was head of the selection board. And so if George Abbey called you, you knew you had been selected. If anybody else on the board called you, you knew you hadn't been selected. So I was called by someone else on the board back in 1984, so I knew I hadn't been selected. And in 1987, when I interviewed, I was out of town. I was on my way to a conference in Canada. And when I landed in Canada, everyone said, well, NASA's been trying to call you. This man named George Abbey's been trying to call you. So I knew. I was pretty sure I had been selected at that point. So I was all excited, and everybody around me was happy, and called my parents, all this stuff. And I asked one of my friends there to sit with me when I called George Abbey back the next morning. And so that's how it happened.
And this is before cell phones. I mean, just and I hate that I even have to bring this up, but I mean, does George Abbey leave a voicemail on your old answering machine? I doubt it. I mean, there's just sort of this this grapevine that starts rattling, and then
because people didn't know how to get in touch with me. I mean, somehow they found where I was staying up in Canada, and they left a message to call him and his phone number and all that. So that's what I did. The next morning, I was trying to remain calm and collected when I called him, and it was funny because he was saying, well, what's the weather like in Canada? This was in August of
he's just stringing you along.
He's really stringing me along. And then I was like, okay, I was trying to be calm and wonder if this really was the call I was expecting or what. And then he said, well, are you still interested in being an astronaut? I was like, yes, absolutely. And then we started talking about that, the mechanics of that. And I still, again, remained calm through the conversation. And then as soon as I hung up, I was with my friend, and she and I were hugging and screaming and very excited.
"670 hours in space as a mission specialist." Hard to believe, isn't it? I mean, 670 hours when you start adding all that up into the 90s. And then you flew with some of the greats. I mean, some of the greatest aviators that are still alive. I'm thinking Hoot Gibson and all of these phenomenal individuals that you got to be around. What stands out about that time in NASA with you and all of these missions that you got to fly?
Well, it was an incredible experience, and it does seem like a dream sometimes. It was 28 days in space over the 3 missions, and I just can't believe it sometimes. But what really stood out to me during that time, the 10 years I was training and flying in space as an astronaut, was the incredible teamwork around the world that made it possible. Now, the astronauts get the attention and the visibility because they're flying in space, but the number of people required to not only build the vehicle, operate the vehicle, build the payload, which is whatever we fly on the shuttle, the experiments, the robot arm, the training, the mission control. I mean, the whole thing was thousands and thousands of people. And these people were just so dedicated and so enthusiastic to make sure that, we were ready to fly, the vehicle was ready to fly, whatever experiments or whatever we were doing was ready to fly. And that's the thing that struck me, was the amount of teamwork and coordination around the world, because all 3 of my missions were international in nature, and the people I flew with, as well as some of the hardware and the experiments. And so I would go to these countries and the same dedication. It was very unifying. I mean, if you think about how many things really unify the world towards one common goal, space is that. And flying in space and operating a space vehicle. Now we have the International Space Station. Is very unifying. And so that was just heartwarming to me to see that, and something I'll never forget, the dedication and teamwork it took to put one of my missions together.
Change gears here and talk about introspection just a little bit, because You said something when we started this that just, I mean, and I deliberately, we didn't talk about this, but your father, and you were estranged. I mean, early on in life, due to divorce. And I know so many people can relate to that. And comes back from the war. Do you know anything about his wartime experience as a child?
Well, he never really talked about it. As a child, I knew he flew in the war, flew airplanes. And in fact, when I was 4 or 5 years old, every time I would see an airplane in the sky, I thought he was flying it, because he stayed in the Air Force and kept flying airplanes in addition to working in the missile program for the Air Force. But, I thought that was him flying. So I thought he was flying all the time. But, and I knew about the war, growing up, kids know about the war. My mother, of course, was very traumatized by him being in combat, being shot down, being a prisoner of war for 21 months. She was a young bride when he went off to training, and she was, I think, 19 when he was a POW. And, for a month or so, she didn't know if he was alive or dead. And so the war was a very painful experience for her, like many in our country. I mean, the whole country pulled together and supported the war. And so she wouldn't talk about it. She wouldn't let my brother play with toy soldiers or, anything that had anything to do with the war. I don't remember either my mother or my father talking about the trauma, or certainly he didn't talk about anything he went through. And she talked about, being home and being, working and going to school and that kind of thing, but not the negative part of it, not the trauma that they both went through. That really, I think they wanted to protect me from that, but they just didn't talk about it.
Well, and clearly they did. I mean, you're not a person that is risk averse. I mean, look at what you've done. But at some point, and this is what I'm so fascinated about, because at some point later in life, this light goes off, and this quest for learning about your father's wartime service comes in, and I'm guessing there was a discovery at some point of his logbooks, of his mission logs. How did that go?
Right. Yes. The times that I visited him as I was growing up, one time, I believe it was when I was in Houston working in the oil industry, I went up to see him. He lived in Fort Worth, Texas. He had already retired by then. And he showed his logbook from being a POW. And for people who were interned at Stalag Luft 3, which was a German Luftwaffe prison for the Allied forces officers who were shot down or bailed out or recovered, they were treated pretty well. The Luftwaffe treated our prisoners pretty well, and we treated their prisoners pretty well. It was a kind of an agreement, with the Air Forces. And so the YMCA and the Red Cross gave the prisoners a blank journal, basically a bound journal, and they gave them pencils and watercolors and things to do art in these journals. My father's hobby was art and drawing cartoons, and he wrote really well. As I said, he was a draftsman, so he could draw things. So his logbook, his POW logbook, was just full of watercolor paintings of him being shot down, of the other prisoners, the camp, and also pencil drawings and color pencil drawings of all the different airplanes that were in the war. And then he wrote a whole journal about what happened. Not everything, because it was censored. So he could write about certain things like how to cook the food and things like that, everyday life, sports they did. anyway, he had this journal that he kept. It's called a wartime log. It's the title that's on the printed on all the blank books. He showed that to me when I visited him in Fort Worth, and that is the only time he ever talked about the war or being a POW, or he would turn each page and he would relate to me what was going on, because it was kind of a visual picture of what prison life was like and what being shot down was like. And so that was just really eye-opening. So I knew about this wartime log. So he passed just before my first space mission, and I always wondered what happened to this log. And thank goodness for social media like Facebook. I looked up my sister's name. She was the oldest from his second marriage, and she has an unusual name. His last name was Smotherman, and so I thought, well, maybe she's on Facebook. So I found her, and I said, if you ever have the time to scan this wartime log, I would love to have a copy of it. And time goes on, we're all busy. It was several years later before she was able to scan it, because it's like 120 pages. And in April of 2020, during COVID, she sent it to me. And there I saw it again and discovered that I really needed to tell his story. And that's why I had the inspiration to write the book. So I had three things to start with. I had his flight records, which she also sent me, which was great because I could see where he was stationed and what airplanes he flew. I had the journal that he had written, a journal to my mother every day that he was overseas until he was shot down. So I have from the time he flew over there to England in 1943, May of 43, till the time he was shot down in late July of 43. And then now I had this wartime log. So that's what I started with, and just digging, doing research about, life at Stalag Luke 3, life in the war, life in combat, the training, the airplanes, all of that. So I had to do a lot of research, but that's what started it, was when he showed that wartime log to me, and later my sister thankfully sent that to me.
Coming up on our next episode, we'll learn more of that story, one that Dr. Jan Davis learned during her final visit with her father, just days before he died, and just weeks before her first flight to space. We'll also find out what she's doing now, and how her father's story and her own is helping educate and inspire the next generation of potential scientists and space explorers. In the meantime, you can purchase Airborne, 2 Generations in Flight from ballastbooks.com. If you order directly from their website, Jan will gladly personalize your copy. Until next time, know the past, shape the future.